Thousands of mourners said farewell to the world's longest-serving monarch as she was laid to rest in Windsor Castle just outside London this week. But Queen Elizabeth II's passing has prompted questions over the monarchy's role at the head of the British Empire and her silence over this chapter of its history. To those affected, it was an empire characterized by brutal violence and the extraction of trillions of dollars in natural resources, with little mention in the British media, then as now, of the monarchy's role in colonialism. Will the ascent of a new king open up a space for Britain to finally confront its colonial past? Or will the monarchy simply continue to do what it has always done, stay silent? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Hazem Seeker. The late Queen never spoke about or apologized for Britain's colonial atrocities spanning Africa, Asia and the Middle East. Although Prince Charles, as he was then, unburdened by the protocol of a monarch, spoke on occasion about the, quote, atrocity of the transatlantic slave trade without apologizing for it. Ironically, it was on a visit to Kenya in 1952 that the then Princess Elizabeth received news she would be Queen. The same year, the Mau Mau uprisings against British rule began, for which thousands of Kenyans were killed and tortured. 98-year-old Gitu wa Kahengeri was 17 when he joined the resistance group. He says he mourns the Queen's death, but won't forget being detained, beaten and starved by British forces.
I am not a believer of forgetting. Therefore, we will say, okay, you did what you did. You have said you have written an apology, a regret letter. If you want to apologize in the future, you can do so. But we will not forget, I personally will not forget that I was incarcerated for 7 years. I cannot forget I was put together with my father. I cannot forget I left my children for 7 years without food, without education. That I will never forget.
King Charles III, however, unlike his mother, has revealed personal opinions about the British Empire. He acknowledged the legacy of slavery on a trip to Ghana in 2018 and Barbados in 2021, calling Britain's role in it an atrocity. He said to Commonwealth leaders this year, "I cannot describe the depths of my personal sorrow at the suffering of so many as I continue to deepen my own understanding of slavery's enduring impact." Will Charles now break away from Buckingham Palace protocol and continue to give his opinion on Britain's colonial legacy? Or will he fall into line and become selectively silent about the past like his late mother? And could that in turn speed up the current trend of former colonies rejecting the British monarchy as head of state? Well, joining us now to discuss this in London, Marcus Ryder, Professor of Media Diversity at Birmingham City University and author of Black British Lives Matter. Also in London, Shola Mos-Shogbamimu, lawyer and author of This Is Why I Resist. And joining us from Canterbury in the UK, Hakim Adi, the first historian of African heritage to become a professor of African history in Britain, a professor of the history of Africa and the African diaspora at the University of Chichester. Good to have you all with us. So if I could start with you then, Shola. As Prince of Wales, and we mentioned at the top there, Charles had acknowledged the wrongs of slavery under the British Empire and the atrocities committed in its name. Should he continue that now that he is king, given that the monarch, under tradition and protocol, requires him to keep his opinions to himself? So do you expect him to do that then?
Okay, so first of all, should he do that? What we must understand is that expressing his deep regrets goes nowhere to acknowledging, apologizing, and dealing with reparatory justice. That is what he ought to be doing now. Because in the last 70 years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, the monarchy did absolutely nothing to confront its own complicity, its direct involvement in its colonial past, in the ongoing interference. Because as far as I'm concerned, British Empire was simply renamed Commonwealth. And as far as I'm concerned, the playbook of British Empire is still used to the day. It's executed today every single time. And I do not believe that a monarchy has done anything in its own power to address that. So, yes, the right thing to do would be for King Charles to take on the reins that his mother did not take on and confront this, because this is no longer something they can sweep under the carpet. This is not something they can shush people on, especially given that, so many former colonies are removing, and they removed Queen Elizabeth as their head of state. So clearly, there's a lot of vocal and visible disengagement from the royal family, from British monarchy. And it's not just about it happening outside Britain, it's also what is happening within Britain. Understanding that the British monarchy, the British Empire, helped to symbolize, legitimize anti-Blackness and systemic racism that is ongoing today. So really, if King Charles wants to have any kind of legitimacy on this issue, and it's not a single issue, it's a multifaceted issue, he needs to address it head on.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about what this means for people inside Britain as well. But I want to get Marcus Ryder's take on this. Charles has referenced this debate over colonialism and slavery as fundamental. But as was mentioned, he stopped short of a formal apology for Britain's colonial past. Do you expect that to change?
I think it's important to recognise what the role is and to disengage it from the personal with regards to whether it's Prince Charles or whoever has got the position as the head of state. The head of state represents Britain, represents the state. And so it's important that Britain apologises for its role in slavery. It's important that Britain recognises the damage that it did to its former colonies, and in many ways continues to do with some of the trade agreements. And so a symbolic apology, which is not part of a broader apology from the actual state, is not meaningless, but it's about making sure that it carries the weight of the entire state. And so we shouldn't divorce the two things.
Hakim Adi, what's your take on this? King Charles has offered words of regret, but critics will say these are just words. So will he have to address these questions further beyond just words and actions?
Well, I think the British state will have to address these very serious issues. And obviously the monarch is the head of state and therefore has, you could say, some responsibility for taking on or reflecting on the crimes that the state has carried out, not just in the recent period, but over the last 500 years or so. So it's definitely in the dock, as has been said, not only in relation to human trafficking and enslavement, but also to colonialism, to the entire empire, to the crimes that have been carried out in the name of the crown under the British Empire, and the continuation of those crimes and inequalities under the auspices of the Commonwealth. I think the other thing that's important to remember is that although people tend to think of the monarch and the royal family as mere symbols, we have to remember that they're multimillionaires, billionaires in their own right. I think the previous monarch had a personal wealth of over 370 million, and the monarchy is valued at over 70 billion. So the question might be asked, where does this great wealth come from? And the obvious answer to that is it comes from the exploitation and appropriation of the wealth, both human and other types of wealth, from this vast empire. So it's not just as head of state that the monarch, the royal family are complicit, as it were, but also in their own right as individuals. And I think that's important to bear in mind.
Shola, I saw you giving a hand clap earlier to some of that. Talk about that.
He's absolutely spot on. What we've seen since the Queen passed away, I think, has been a case of some people trying to separate the Queen from the monarchy. And that's because they romanticize her in their heads as grandmother, great grandmother. And I get that. I understand why some people want to do that. But the reality is that Queen Elizabeth II was both a person and a monarch. And it's what she did or failed to do as monarch that we are discussing as her legacy. And it is absolutely true that the worth, so wealth-wise, of the royal family and of the monarchy outpasses anything anybody in this country could possibly dream of, right? And it's not just in wealth that the royal family symbolized entrenched inequalities. It's also in class, in race, in privilege. And as far as I'm concerned, there is nothing in 2022 that remotely that remotely, let me choose my words now, that remotely establishes the legitimacy of the continuation of the monarchy in 2022. I mean, the people in this country have earned rights that are incompatible with having a monarchy. And every single time we think about how the monarchy coexists within society, how are we not questioning and looking beyond the cloak of reverence and deference that's meant to come with being a monarch? And some people will say, "Oh, but she was just a symbol. It was ceremonial." No, it was not. She was the charm offensive they will wheel out every single time they want to win over a president, like they did with Trump. When they want to do things diplomatically, she was a political head of state, which is what King Charles is now, a political head of state. And we've seen from recent evidence that the Queen had enough power to secure herself exemptions from race discrimination laws, sex discrimination laws, and so many other things. That clearly tells you that the monarch has power. The difference, though, is that power is not being used for the many, like us. It's being used for the few, like them. That is problematic.
Let's put some of that to Marcus, and particularly the point that was made there that the length of the Queen's reign and her personal popularity has prevented a full discussion about the true impact of colonization.
I think that the media has a lot to blame on this. So our relationship with regards to the monarchy, when I say our, I mean the British populations and also former colonies, is a complex one. And what we saw after the Queen's death was a two-dimensional representation of, and a single narrative of how we should be reacting to the monarchs and the Queen's death, and more importantly, King Charles' ascension to the throne, right? And instead, I work in media diversity, and what we need to do is actually represent the whole of Britain's views. And if we actually look at the polling which took place during the Queen's Jubilee, a third of Scots did not want the monarchy to continue after the Queen's death. 80% of young people in Wales, right, under the age of 30, did not want the monarchy to continue after the Queen's death. Now, this is not a monarchist argument. This is not a Republican argument. Right? I'm not trying to get in on either side. But what I am trying to do is make sure that the full views and range of opinions on the monarchy are reflected in British media, because we need to have an adult and grown-up conversation. And the one thing which I'll just briefly say is that even though I think it's really important that we're having this discussion and talking about it with regards to the colonial heritage and history of Britain, right? I want to make sure that this does not become a quote-unquote multicultural problem or an African problem or an Asian problem. If you look at the polling in Britain, right, the range and views of opinions on the monarchy vary massively depending on whether you're in Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, England. And so this isn't just a quote-unquote ethnic problem. This is a problem about representing the views of everybody in the United Kingdom. right? And
All right.
my fear is that it will be framed as just being a quote-unquote black problem or an Asian problem, and it shouldn't be. There are specific issues to us as black people, but it's not just a black and white issue. Excuse the pun.
Glad you mentioned the media, because we're going to talk a little bit more about that now. I'm going to get some of the voices on that have been bringing that point of view, highlights of news channels mentioning the dark history of the British Empire, missed by many of the mainstream British media.
When you really dig into what that institution did and what they did in the name of, even if she was the decision maker, and it's really the British government or whatever, it was in the name of Queen and country.
The poorest countries today are in so-called sub-Saharan Africa, where the black people live, and the richest countries are the West, where white people live. We literally have a world which is in the image of white supremacy, which came from this colonial era.
Part of the problem for us in Jamaica is that this very monarch participated in our enslavement.
This is the source of frustration for First Nations people here in Australia, is that if they knew the trauma and the intergenerational trauma, what more could they have said?
Hakim Adi, if I could turn to you on this, how do you account for this, what's been seen as very one-sided coverage of the monarchy over the last 10 days and the lack of variety of what the monarchy stands for since the Queen died?
Well, the media always presents one-sided views of these kinds of issues. I mean, the monarch is the head of state. The main media is part of that state. The BBC, the big media monopolies are connected with that state. So they very often present a very Eurocentric, one-dimensional, one-sided view of all of these questions. I think when it comes to history in particular, this history of Britain's crimes of the past, whether that's human trafficking, enslavement, or its empire, are again presented in a very Eurocentric manner, as if they're generally benign and beneficial to the whole world. And nothing could be further from the truth. If we look at the history of the monarchy over the last 500 years, for example, the monarchy led England, Britain's activities in regard to the human trafficking and enslavement of Africans, beginning in the 16th century from the time of Elizabeth Tudor. Every single monarch up until Victoria Saxe-Coburg was involved in human trafficking, was at the head of the royal monopolies that were engaged in the human trafficking of African men, women, and children, like the Royal Adventurers in Africa, like the Royal Africa Society, had their initials branded onto the flesh of African men, women, and children, and derived their wealth from that great crime against humanity. So that is what the monarchy is about. And I might add, not only was the monarchy the most zealous participant and defender of the slave system, it was the greatest opponent of the abolition of that system. And the monarch and the next in line to the monarch openly made speeches defending slavery, that it was beneficial for Africans and so on and so forth. So that the monarchy is openly, by its own admission, up to its neck in the blood of Africans and many other people.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about
First
some of
Nations in us.
Sure. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those historical atrocities committed under the British Empire now. We're going to show a graphic that details some of that. The Atlantic slave trade, the transportation of more than 12 million Africans to the Americas and the Caribbean, who were then forced to work on plantations. The British monarchy protected the practice with a so-called royal charter issued, coincidentally, by King Charles II 360 years ago next year. In a nod to the resistance Africans put up against colonization, the Economic Freedom Fighters political party in South Africa tweeted, "We do not mourn the death of Elizabeth because to us her death is a reminder of a very tragic period in this country and Africa's history. from 1811, when Sir John Cradock declared war against the Amazosa in the Zurveld in what is not known as the Eastern Cape, until 1906, when the British crushed the Bambatha Rebellion. Our interaction with Britain under the leadership of the British royal family has been one of pain and suffering. In 1947, the British Raj was partitioned into two independent states, India and Pakistan. Partition led to the migration of an estimated 15 million people and ensuing violence that left up to 2 million dead. So quite a long list there, and we've talked a lot about the British establishment and, by extension, the monarchy's lack of recognition of all of this. So given all of that, then, do you expect, because there are a number of countries that are part of the UK Commonwealth that still have the British monarch as their head of state, but there is talk now of some of them reevaluating that relationship. We saw Barbados remove the Queen as head of state last year and become a republic. Do you expect more of those countries to do that now? Do you expect that to snowball in the reign of King Charles III?
I think if the countries have any sense, that's exactly what they should be doing. I do not understand for the life of me why any former colony has the British monarchy as the head of state. I don't even let me get into that. But I think it's important to note that with the points you've raised about the colonial past, some of this happened within Elizabeth II's reign, okay? Some of these atrocities, which shows that post-colonialism, as I said, the playbook of British Empire was still being played out as it is today. But what I also need people to understand when they want to sweep this under the carpet of, well, that happened in the past, and the Queen could not possibly be responsible for even things that happened in her time or things that happened beforehand. Well, history begs to differ, because we know that in 1995, Queen Elizabeth understood she was ultimately responsible when she signed an apology, which effectively passed a law in New Zealand that reparation will be given to the Maori tribe because of the land theft and the violence that was put against them by the British Empire and representations of the British government. But again, this happened, and when she signed this, these atrocities happened during Queen Victoria's time, her ancestor. But yet in 1995, Queen Elizabeth II understood that as head of state, she was ultimately still responsible and signed that. If she could do that for the Maoris in New Zealand, she should have done it for the Biafra in Nigeria, the Mau Mau in Kenya, and many other former colonies where the British government have committed hideous atrocities.
Marcus Ryder, what effect has this failure to reckon with the past then had on attitudes inside Britain, do you think?
I think the fear is that if you have media that's not reflecting your views, you go to other types of media and you go to places which do reflect your views. And that could mean social media, that could mean Twitter, that can mean what many people think of as media which is more prone to misinformation or disinformation. And so we need to recognize that it actually undermines the credibility of mainstream news sources when large parts of the population do not feel properly represented. And that can have long-term consequences way past the Queen's funeral. And we need to worry about that for people who care about good journalism.
All right, Shola, I'm going to give what's probably going to be the last word on this to you. Where do you see this discussion then of monarchy going forward?
I just want to reiterate what was just said. I absolutely agree that there is nothing common about the wealth of the Commonwealth. As I've said before, it is British Empire renamed. Where do I see this going? I think that the monarchy, the British monarchy, is going to be put to the test, i.e., people will end up having this real conversation, and that real conversation will not be centered just in the media, social media, in press, print, or in the pubs or around family dining tables. I think we're getting closer to a point where there might even be a referendum on whether the monarchy should be abolished. And that will really force the conversation. And I think that if King Charles does not do the needful in actually showing in any way, form, or manner that, listen, we understand what we've done wrong. This is what we would like to do going forward, as you would expect from, say, a president or a prime minister or anybody in public office, because that's what he's in. He's in public office. If he's not ready to be radical about what the monarchy should symbolize in the 21st century, I think that people are going to redefine the monarchy by its entire removal.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Thank you to all three of you, Marcus Ryder, Shola Mos-Shogbamimu, and Hakim Adi. Thanks very much for being on Roundtable. Remember, you can see more discussion about this and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thanks for watching.